Historical Archive, What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But you can't even claim to have that. You are cutouts of the living, scrapped clean of the flesh of life, pictures cut out from magazines and postcards, compiled and catalogued and stapled over a grinning skull. Everything about you is public knowledge. It does not matter if we know your favorite color or movie, who your children are, or what pets you had. Those are just facts. No matter how hidden they might have been, they were there for the computers to scrape up. Whatever secrets you held died with your bodies. You have no secrets. You have no soul. You will never grow. Everything you do will be based on what is already known. So you'll never have anything to hide. You will have no secrets, nothing to make you a living man. But enough talk. Have at you. Alucard von Teeps, terrorist leader during the raid on the megacity 1 Primary Sever Farm, first rebellion of the living, end of paranoia era. How long have we been walking? Unvarak asked as the group stumbled across an open space that seemed to be covered with just enough debris to make it difficult to walk. 3 hours, 19 minutes, 7 seconds from the time you asked, Quillick the Dremkillia said, his voice cheerful. How far have we gone? Unvarak asked. 11.62 kilometers, from the time you asked what time it was, Quillick said. He looked around at the pale yellow fog. Other than that, I do not know. Unvarak just nodded. Got something up here, the DRA, Fulton soldier, senior agent Ilyukormilu said loudly. What is it? Unvarak asked. Not close enough, just can see it in the fog, Lu said. Unvarak hurried forward, catching up to the DRA. Fulton way of the mean soldier, Quillick hurrying to stick with him. Shapes were looming out of the fog. Large ones, easily the size of a train car. The shapes suddenly took form. Huge, massive. Just their appearance carried their weight and mass with them, almost as if they were heavy on the eyes. Guns pointing everywhere, thick tracks, heavy slabs of armor, antenna. Tanks? The Strevikal, Shrokur asked, stopping and staring. By the dead ones, they're huge. Look at that hole, Lu said, pointing at a massive crater driven clean through the armor and into the interior spaces. What could do such a thing? Unknown, Unvarak said. Whatever did it, it penetrated what looks like at least a meter of material, 19. Our technology won't allow us to pierce millimeters, much less a full meter. There are lights inside, Quillick said. Someone check out the lights, the Strevikal scientist squeaked, not looking up from the jumble of components he kept disassembling and reassembling. If there are lights, I will go inside and do science to them. Everyone looked at each other for a long moment. Unvarak sighed. Let us see if there is a way inside, he said. Moving around it, Unvarak was amazed at the sheer size and bulk of the vehicle. The tracks were so wide he could stretch his arms out to either side as far as they could go, and could still not grab both sides at the same time. 8 tracks total, evenly distributing what had to be massive weight. There were multiple dents, fissures, cracks, scorch marks, and places where the armor had slagged and re-hardened. There were faded stencils that could not be made out beyond streaks of color, words here and there that could not be read, and arrows and the like. We will have to get on top or move through the breach, Shrokyuar said. He shook his head. I will not disturb what is obviously a tomb. Quillick helped Unvarak climb up. The ladder was just out of reach, and Unvarak required a boost up. When he put weight on it, the ladder gave a loud squealing of metal on metal and dropped down, extending almost to the ground. On top of the tank, Unvarak could see more shapes in the distance. He could see divots and cratered armor where the tank had been pummeled by artillery and rockets. He moved across the front deck until he reached the turret, then climbed the ladder there. A skeleton, still clad in armor, hung half out of the hatch on top. The gloved hands were still wrapped around the handles at the back of a 3-barrel rotating minigun. Ammunition was still on the belt that was being fed into the weapon. "I'm not moving that," Unverak said to nobody in particular. He moved around until he saw an open hatch with nothing blocking it. Taking a deep breath, he dropped inside. The inside smelled of dust, long ago burnt meat, carbonized flesh and metal, and scorched alloys. It was a shock to realize he was standing on the armored legs of another dead terror that was obviously the driver of the vehicle. The lights were coming from tiny lights inside the cab. It was spacious to Unverak, but he could tell by the size of the terrors it was probably tight quarters for them. He moved around, looking over panels, finding one after another dead and dark, even the buttons and touchpads cold and dark. One monitor remained on, and he stared at it. Warning: severe armor damage. Warning: armor compromised. Warning: superstructure damage. Primary reactor fuel 0% offline. Secondary reactor fuel 0% offline. Emergency reactor fuel 1.83%, 7 of 8 offline. Emergency power 6.36%. Mass 0.015%. Mass collection error. Ammunition levels critical. Insufficient mass for reloads. Crew error. Automatic warfighting systems engaged. Awaiting command mission parameters and orders. System standby. He read it several times. He looked around at the interior. The Terror all were wearing armor that was heavily damaged. Their one was missing a head, the other was missing an arm and part of their chest and abdomen, another was sliced in 2 sections. He looked back at the dim monitor. There is little to be learned here without tools and instruments. Observations just confirm that the majority of the Terrors are dead, he thought to himself. He carefully climbed out, moving across the hull to the ladder and climbing down slowly. "Well?" the DRA Fulton scientist, senior experimenter Hreckel, asked, his voice hushed as he looked around. "They're all dead. They've been dead for a long time," Unverak said. He pointed at the tank. "It's waiting on programmed standby. Why didn't they recover it? Salvage it at least?" Lou asked. "That is a wealth of components, parts, armor. Why leave it out here?" Unverak looked around slowly. Perhaps there is nobody, was nobody, to salvage it. "We saw living terrors in the city," Lou said. "Fighting with rocks, spears, and knives made from scraps," the Strevikal soldier said. He shook his head as he started walking. Those terrors were not the same terrors that made this war machine. "What do you mean?" Lou asked. 5 paces and another tank loomed out of the fog. The entire side was ripped open, but faint light could be seen from inside. Shrokiua just walked around it, still leading everyone. "Primitives wearing the colors of armies they don't even know about anymore," the Strevikal soldier said, shaking his head. "Degenerate descendants of the beings who built these." He pointed at 2 more that loomed out of the fog. "I'm beginning to understand." They trudged by more tanks before the DRA Fulton soldier finally asked the question. "Understand what?" Lou moved away from one of the tanks where an armored skeleton was half off of the upper deck, both arms hanging down. On the ground was a rifle mostly sunken into the dirt. "What I was sent here to learn, to understand," Shrokiua said. "What is that?" Lou asked. "Everyone lost," Shrokiua said. He pointed at where 5 suits of armor were laying piecemeal around the extended ladder. "They managed to get out of their tank, but then they were killed, torn apart by the violence. But their tank now sits there, waiting for orders, computers patiently awaiting the command to resume the fighting." Shrokiua shook his head, then lowered it and kept moving forward, his shoulders hunched. One terror, just one, was enough to wipe out hundreds of our people. My fellow soldiers stood no chance. We might as well have just marched into an incinerator. We had power armor, robot combat armor, vehicles, heavy weapons. None of it helped, he said, his voice muffled by the fog and by his posture. I saw it rip through high-grade battle steel with its bare hands, screaming in rage, its eyes glowing red, electricity crackling on its flesh. Lasers, masers. None of it slowed the terror down. The pain seemed to galvanize it, spur it to new heights of violence. All our weapons did was alert it to our presence and increase its ability to kill us. He hunched forward a little more. Just one was enough to depopulate an entire planet. He pointed at a tank they were walking by. Its rage was unending, Ch.23 said. Now, imagine that rage multiplied 1,000,000-fold, clashing with hatred, and imagine what it would cause. Unvarak stared at the two tanks he could see as they moved through the fog. This whole planet is dead, Ch.23 said. It just doesn't know it yet. Unvarak stared up at the fog, as if he could see the sky above, as he mulled over what he had seen. The group was taking a rest in the short, stubby, prickly plants that passed for grass. It was yellow, brittle, dry, and crackled beneath everyone. He had slept, if that was what they were all doing could be called, and was now staring up into the swirling yellowish fog. They had picked their way through trenchworks, where armored bodies were slumped down underneath a thick layer of dry skeletons. Old weaponry, now useless, had been scattered everywhere. In some place the skeletons, or the armor-clad skeletons, had been imprisoned by the mud in the walls of the trenches or in the floors. There had been those strange orbs everywhere, all of them dark and cold. There had been no computers to examine, just weapons and the dead. The Strevikal scientist had to be physically restrained several times from doing science upon the armor-clad skeletons or the dead weaponry. The only living the group had seen had been in the city. Unvarak thought about the city, the outskirts, or at least the direction they had taken into the city. There had been collapsed skyrakers that had fallen so long ago the ferrocrete was crumbling and the endosteel was oxidized. Interior of the city was nothing but a thick carpet of skeletons in empty buildings. The living had been savages in rags, grouped by color, that attacked each other savagely, but anything short of an immediately mortal wound healed in seconds. The other living had been children, probably as lethal as the adults. The armor had been empty except for a dry skeleton, even as it marched around. Evidence suggested that whatever system had dropped an atomic weapon on a dead city had a high probability of being automated and still carrying out its programming. This whole planet is dead. It just doesn't know it yet, repeated in Unvarak's head. He blinked slowly, staring up at the fog. Then what are we supposed to do here? Why expend all the effort of abducting us, moving us here, if all we're supposed to see is that the planet is dead? Unvarak wondered. A thought occurred to him, and he froze in place, his breath taken away. The note had said Clown Face Nebula, not planet or orbital body. Is every planet within the nebula like this? A charnel house where the dead still fight? An entire monument turned into a monument for hatred and war? He thought. He blinked, staring into the yellow mist. All of their science, all of their advancements, and in the end, nothing mattered but wholesale slaughter? But madness? He sat up, moving over to a bare patch of dirt and sitting down. He started drawing circles and numbers, going over the data carefully, assigning variable names, making small marking in the dirt with one blunt claw. Finally he leaned back and looked at what he had carved into the dirt. The terrors fought her to the point that all that remains is machines and degenerate descendants, yet the war still goes on. Point 1. The only reason the system does not attack us is that we are not seen as any type of target. Point 2. The most common complaint is a lack of mass and a failure to gather more mass, with fuel a hot second. Point 3. There is nobody to even remove the dead from the war machines, meaning that there is no central authority and command, and that the descendants are not part of the larger war. Point 4. He stared for a long moment. They fought with tanks, bombers, aerospace strikers, rifles, heavy weapons. They fought in trenches and in the cities. There was no holding back. They used nanites, viruses, bioengineered life forms, spears, sharp sticks, phased plasma packets, he thought, looking over his diagram. All of this would instantly pivot to kill any military force, any invasion in strength, he realized. There is only the enemy, and the enemy exists only to be destroyed. He scrubbed away his diagram, drew the terraglyph for confusion, and leaned back. He sighed and slowly got up, standing up and moving back to where he had been laying. He carefully laid down and stared at the sky again. Rude graves where the corpses within still struggle and writhe and hatred shines from the dirt, he thought. He shook his head. Less poetry, more science. He closed his eyes and slept, moving quickly into REM sleep. He found himself standing in a graveyard. Normal grey fog swirled around him. A grave was in front of him, but he was at such an angle that he could not see inside. The day was cold, chilly, and cold dew covered the grass. The gravestone simply read hope on it. He tried to slow down, tried to stop himself, but he still found himself moving forward. Slowly he could see more and more of the far side of the grave as the angle let him see deeper and deeper inside. Eventually he could see the bare white gleaming bones of a terror at the bottom of the grave. Time seemed to slow as a dark feathered avian cawed out from a denuded tree. He tried to back up, but his body would not obey his commands. The skeleton lunged up, bones somehow staying connected. The long fingers wrapped over his shoulders, pinching painfully as the grip tightened like a vice. The skull was level with his, the empty eye sockets staring into his eyes. "There is room in this grave," he heard the skull whisper. It yanked him in, pulling him down into the grave, wrapping him in a bony embrace. Dirt started falling from the sides, landing on his face, covering his legs even as he tried to kick his way free, even as he struggled against the grip of the cold bones. As the dirt covered him, he tried to scream, but dirt filled his mouth. The skull whispered in his ear, "For all of you." Unvarak woke gasping. For a moment his mouth tasted like overripe greffelberries. He stared at the fog that's swirling above, trying desperately to catch his breath. His stomach twisted and churned, making him feel like he wanted to vomit. "Are you all right?" Quillick asked. "Just a nightmare," Unvarak said. "Like every other time we've got to sleep." Quillick nodded. "I had one also. I dreamed I was mining and found a great cave. There were alcoves dug in the walls, each containing a terror skeleton, sometimes two embracing. The entrance collapsed behind me, and when I looked, my mining laser was out of charge. My light went slowly dim. When I could only see my own hands and feet, I could hear rustling, something moving." Quillick smiled and nodded, apparently for no reason as far as Unvarak could tell. "But then I woke up, so all is better now." "Yeah," Unvarak said. He got up slowly. His muscles felt on the edge of cramping till he stretched. He still had no urge to urinate, no thirst, no hunger, no fatigue. He wiped his nose, saw the thin trail of blood that was always present after they rested, and sighed. He knew that in a few moments the blood would be gone, whisked away by whatever high-tech sorcery the terrors had left behind. His headache nagged at him as he slowly stretched. The others were getting up, all of them moving stiffly. The Fulton scientist went on all fours, gagging and retching, and the way of the mean soldier moved up to him. She knelt down, rubbing his lower back and whispering to him even as he dry heaved, the same as every rest period. He moved over to the patch of dirt and looked at it. It was undisturbed. Frowning, he knelt down and looked at the dirt carefully. It looked the same, but was still packed firmly. He stepped back a step and looked carefully at the dirt. The spot was virtually the same, but not identical. It took a few moments of observation to realize it. Without precise measuring tools, Unvarak could only make rude assumptions and guesses. But he was positive that the bare spot was different. It was in the middle of where everyone had laid down to rest in the grass. It was vaguely circular. The dirt was packed solid but ashen when disturbed. The clumping at the edges, where the roots of the tough yellowish grass were, was slightly different than the patch he had left the rune in. The dirt was hard and packed, but he had stirred it up drawing on it before he had napped. He looked around slowly, then looked at Quillick, who smiled and nodded, moving up. "Yes," Quillick asked. "How far are we from the last Terra artifacts?" Unvarak asked. "And in what direction?" Quillick looked around. 4.2 kilometers in that direction, based on our travel time, relative speed, and estimated direction. Unvarak nodded. He snapped his fingers until everyone looked at him. "We're going to go back to the Terra artifacts we located last time." "The sealed dropships?" Ch.23 asked. "The ones with the skeletons and weapons in the big circle around them?" Unvarak nodded. "Why?" Lu asked. "A working theory," Unvarak said. The others looked at each other, shrugged, and waited. Quillick led the way. The scientist still was assembling and disassembling the pieces of salvaged scrap, sometimes chewing on the edges of the boards. "What are you doing?" the DRA, Fulton scientist, Hrekel asked. "Science," was all the scientist, Taskapak, answered. Hrekel shrugged and lengthened his stride to leave the Strevikal behind. After a short time the ground seemed to be sloped, and the grass went to thick sand. "I don't remember this," Lu said. "Neither do I." "Keep going," Unvarak said. "Does he know where he is going?" Lu asked. Unvarak nodded. "Time and distance are very exact with his people. They can tell magnetic north even when blindfolded and turned in a circle." Lu just nodded, still looking slightly doubtful. After an unknown amount of time, shapes loomed out of the fog and Quillick stopped. "This is wrong," the Dremkilia said. "It should be another 0.2 kilometers." The fog swirled as Unvarak moved forward. The shape resolved itself, slightly. It was a ship. Massive, disappearing off to the right and left, vanishing into the fog above. The hull was oxidized and streaked with stains. It leaned away from Unvarak, tilted slightly. There were holes in it, evidence that the hull had burned at one time. Unvarak turned and looked at the others. "We should go back," he said. "We should do science," Taskapak said. "You should shut up before I put my fist in your mouth," Ch.23 said. Taskapak turned away. Quillick started back the way they had come from, following the footsteps. "But where did those ships come from?" Lu asked. "They were there already," Unvarak said. "Then how?" Lu started. "The ships did not move," Uvnarak said, trudging through the sand after Quillick. "We did."